Welcome back to another deep dive on The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly dramatic cautionary tale. We're looking at Southern Electric Power Company Limited, better known as SEPCOL. This is a fascinating story about cutting-edge technology, a booming energy sector, and honestly, a pretty spectacular corporate collapse. It leaves us with some absolutely crucial lessons about how massive infrastructure projects actually survive, or, fail, in the real world. I am thrilled to guide you through this, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are running a massive, highly technical business. You've got hundreds of employees, state-of-the-art machinery, and you provide a service that an entire city literally relies on just to keep the lights on. Now imagine that, by law, you're only allowed to sell your product to exactly one customer. And then, one day, that single customer just stops paying you on time. So what happens to your business? Well, this isn't some hypothetical scenario. It's the exact dilemma that brought a pioneering energy giant right to its knees.
2.21 Pakistani rupees. That's it. That was the rock-bottom share price of SEPCOL right before it was officially delisted from the stock exchange. To really understand how shocking this is, you've got to realize that at its peak, this company had a multi-billion rupee valuation. I mean, it was the crown jewel of private energy investment. So how in the world does a multi-billion asset lose practically all of its value, turn into a penny stock, and then just vanish? That's the central mystery we're going to solve today.
Section 1. The Promise of SEPCOL.
So, to really grasp this, we first need to understand the business model. SEPCOL was an IPP, or independent power producer. Back in the mid-90s, Pakistan was dealing with some severe power shortages. To fix this, and fix it fast, the government rolled out the power policy of 1994. They basically said, look, we need private companies, backed by private money, to build power plants and sell the electricity to our national grid. And SEPCOL was one of the very first entities to step up to the plate under this brand new framework.
Building directly on that 94 policy, this wasn't just some small local project. It was a massive international consortium. Incorporated in 1994, SEPCOL had huge backing from foreign sponsors, like Canada's BC Hydro International. They managed to secure a highly lucrative 30-year power purchase agreement with WAPTA, the State Water and Power Authority. Their mission? To provide essential baseload voltage support for the Lahore Electric Supply Company. They were specifically targeting the heavy industrial load in the Raiwind Manga corridor. They were quite literally powering the region's industrial development.
Now, what's really interesting here, and we definitely need to clear this up, is the name. Because Southern and SEPCO are thrown around a lot in the energy world, people constantly mix them up. SEPCO, down in Raiwind, was a private IPP running on heavy fuel oil with Finnish diesel engines. That is entirely different from the LPGCL Lakra plant, which is a public government entity burning indigenous coal in Sindh. And it's also completely unrelated to SEPCO 3, the huge Chinese construction giant. So, just to be clear, today our focus is strictly on that private oil-burning IPP in Raiwind.
Moving on to Section 2. Inside the Raiwind plant.
The engineering here was absolutely next level. SEPCOL hit commercial operations in 1999, which brought a massive transfer of Finnish technology straight to Pakistan. They installed 5 large-bore medium-speed Wärtsilä diesel engines. This setup gave them a gross capacity of over 117 megawatts, feeding a super reliable 110 megawatts net directly into their own dedicated 132 kilovolt switchyard. And because they ran on heavy fuel oil, they were highly efficient and could start up incredibly fast to meet those peak demands in the Lahore region. We're talking about a sprawling 25-acre facility right on the Raiwind Manga Road. At its operational peak, this wasn't just a handful of people pushing buttons in a control room. SEPCOL maintained this really complex corporate technical hierarchy with about 150 to 250 personnel. They had specialized engineering departments working 24/7 on heavy engine overhauls. They had these enormous fuel decanting bays for oil tankers, and even an on-site testing lab for fuel and oil analysis. It was a bustling, totally self-sustaining industrial heartbeat.
Which brings us to Section 3, the squeeze, circular debt.
You really can't talk about this story without talking about circular debt. So, in a single buyer market, the government power purchaser buys the electricity. But what happens if the government doesn't collect enough money from the people actually using the electricity? Well, they delay payments to the power plant. And if SEPCOL doesn't get paid, they don't have the cash to buy heavy fuel oil from their suppliers. No fuel means those massive Wärtsilä engines can't run. And if the engines aren't running, they generate zero power, but they are still bleeding money on maintenance and staffing. It's basically an inescapable systemic liquidity crunch.
And that squeeze leads directly to a staggering number, 1.7 billion Pakistani rupees. During their final operational years, the sheer lack of money to buy fuel just destroyed the company's balance sheets. They were taking on massive annual losses, often hitting over 1.7 billion rupees a year. They simply couldn't absorb the shock of those delayed payments. See, unlike a massive utility company with a diversified portfolio, SEPCOL was a single-asset company. They had one plant. When that one plant couldn't afford fuel, the entire corporate structure just started to suffocate.
And this brilliantly illustrates our fourth section, the inevitable collapse. Let's walk through this timeline together. The early years were definitely filled with promise. Incorporated in 94, full commercial operations by 99, and they had a really solid run up until about 2010. But as that circular debt crisis deepened between 2010 and 2015, maintenance slipped, and the fuel literally ran out. By January 2016, the Pakistan Stock Exchange totally suspended trading of SEPCOL shares. Why? Because corporate governance had completely broken down. They weren't even holding annual meetings or submitting financial reports anymore. Finally, in October 2019, they were officially wiped off the exchange. Probably the most sobering moment of this entire explainer comes from late 2017. The final CEO, M. Khalid Rashid, who was trying to navigate the company's winding-up phase, wrote a letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He flat-out declared that SEPCOL was no longer a going concern. By that point, most of the staff, those highly trained engineers and managers we talked about, had already resigned, simply because they weren't getting paid. That impressive technical hierarchy had just dissolved.
Fast forward to today, 2026, and the reality is pretty grim. The contrast with that vibrant 200-person peak operation couldn't be starker. SEPCOL is officially defunct and dissolved. It's totally struck off the SCP's active list. That massive 25-acre plant is completely decommissioned and mothballed. Instead of generating power, the ghost of the company is just tangled up in litigation with creditors. Its only remaining value is basically as a distressed asset, meaning it's worth whatever the real estate it sits on is worth, plus whatever scrap metal can be pulled from those silent engines.
Finally, Section 5, the legacy of a pioneer.
Look, before the financial architecture completely failed them, we have to give them credit for a massive technological win. SEPCOL's engineers did exactly what they set out to do. They successfully brought complex Finnish engine technology to Pakistan, and they proved that large-scale diesel generation was a highly viable way to provide rapid, critical grid support. I mean, for nearly 2 decades, they provided invaluable voltage stabilization to Lahore. On a purely technical level, the plant was an absolute success.
But when we look back, their legacy is ultimately an economic cautionary tale. It powerfully exposes the systemic risks of the independent power producer model when it's structured this way. SEPCOL proved that it absolutely doesn't matter how brilliant your technology is or how desperately the public needs your electricity. If you are a single-asset private company relying entirely on one state-run purchaser, you are incredibly vulnerable. When that single buyer's cash flow dries up, the private producer is the one left holding the bag.
So that leaves us with a really big question to ponder. As countries all over the world continue to build out these complex, modernized power grids, often mixing private innovation with state control, we really have to look at the ghost of SEPCOL. If a single buyer's financial hiccup can totally wipe out a thriving, critical energy pioneer, just how financially safe and resilient is the grid of tomorrow? It's a question that every policymaker and, honestly, every energy investor needs to answer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next one.